Marvel has created thousands upon thousands of characters over the years, so it makes sense that for every Spider-Man or Captain America or Incredible Hulk, there is an Unus the Untouchable or the Mad Thinker or something like that. But in this video, I want to talk to you guys about a character who is arguably one of the most powerful characters to ever exist in Marvel Comics, but has just kind of been forgotten and relegated to being a background character. And that's Awesome Andy. So Awesome Android first showed up in Fantastic Four number 15 way back in 1963. Now this is early Marvel, right? So we're talking about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And at this point, Marvel was basically throwing all kinds of characters at the wall to see what would stick. And so the Mad Thinker, who was a Fantastic Four villain and quite literally an evil genius obsessed with logic and prediction, ends up building Awesome Andy using stolen tech from Reed Richards. Now, if you've ever seen him, Awesome Andy he's huge and he doesn't really have any features. He has no facial features whatsoever, right? He's got no personality. He doesn't really even talk. He's just this obedient lump of synthetic muscle. And here's a cool thing. This guy has the power to copy powers. So if he touches you, he'll duplicate all the abilities you have. And for those of you guys who are going to ask the question, no, I'm not aware that he's ever fought the Incredible Hulk, but he has touched Thor, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But in the first appearance that he has in Fantastic Four number 15, he's actually tasked by the Mad Thinker to defeat the Fantastic Four when the Mad Thinker invades the Baxter Building. Now in the conflict between the two, Awesome Andy touches the Thing, and right off the bat, you know this guy's going to be powerful because he copies all the attributes of the Thing. Everything from his rocky hide all the way to his super strength. Now, he doesn't take on the actual color of the Thing, but everything else is still the same. So much so that he absolutely crushes Ben Grimm, right? Gives him a run for his money. Now, of course, the whole fight ends up coming down to Reed Richards and Susan Storm, who figure out that there's basically a pressure-sensitive spot under his arm, and if they touch it, they can shut Awesome Andy down, which is exactly what happens. I mean, this is clearly early Marvel stuff. It's corny fun and surprisingly creative, to be honest. But after this debut, Awesome Andy just kind of becomes one of those characters who just keeps showing up whenever somebody needs a reliable, silent bruiser within their story. And so over the next few decades, he fights a ton of superheroes. He goes up against the original X-Men and the Fantastic Four in Fantastic Four issue number 28. And in fact, that's when you learn that his ability to copy powers is not restricted to the Fantastic Four, something that was easy to assume because the Mad Thinker was always a Fantastic Four villain. In that fight, he copies the powers of Iceman, Bobby Drake. He fights Iron Man in the Tales of Suspense comics, and in fact, when that happens, he copies the look of Iron Man. And in fact, there's one point in the story where he's basically looking down, and he almost looks like an Iron Man version of Black Manta from DC Comics. He fights Captain America in the 80s. And of course, he fights the Thing multiple times because he's largely a Fantastic Four villain at that point. But the reality is that the Mad Thinker just keeps dusting him off and then sending him back into battle. And every time he shows up, it's always the same basic formula. He mimics powers, he causes chaos, and then he gets shut down again. He does crash Reed and Sue's wedding in Fantastic Four Annual number 3, which was basically Marvel's big crossover event at the time. So even if he wasn't overly important, he was definitely visible. But then there was an Avengers arc in the 1980s called Heavy Metal, which technically ran between Avengers 286 to 303, but 286 to 289 is where Awesome Andy ends up joining a villain team called Heavy Metal. Now, it's a group of robots and synthetics that are put together by the Mad Thinker to take on the Avengers, and this storyline didn't really reinvent him, but it is the first time in comics that we sort of hint that maybe there's actually more going on to this guy than just being some silent android that obediently follows tasks. He doesn't talk, but he starts acting a little more independently, moving on his own and then reacting without any commands. One of the other cool things we learned in this story is that a person with powers does not have to be conscious for Awesome Andy to copy their abilities. That actually happened with Monica Rambeau, who at the time was using the name Captain Marvel. Awesome Andy picked her up when she was unconscious, copied her powers, and then started firing off energy blasts all over the place. But during this point in time, he was largely just floating around the edges of stories involving Marvel's smart villain clubs. You're talking about guys like MODOK, the Leader, Red Ghost, the various villains that would come together in the group that we now call the Intelligentsia. I mean, he's never really a major player there, but he does pop up often enough to simply just be noticed. And this kind of goes on for years and years and years and years in Marvel Comics. Awesome Andy's there, he kind of does some stuff, and then that's basically it. But then you go into 2004, and Dan Slott starts writing She-Hulk, and instead of turning it into a standard superhero book, he actually takes it back to the John Byrne days, where it's almost kind of a blend between comic comedy and action. And so She-Hulk ends up joining this law firm that specializes in superhuman law, and the entire supporting cast is just made up of like C- and D-list characters. And who shows up as an office assistant? Awesome Andy. But here's the twist. He's not really a villain anymore, so he doesn't really use the name Awesome Android. Now it's just good old-fashioned Awesome Andy, and he ends up working a desk job. So he basically just files paperwork and serves coffee, but he does wear a tie. He doesn't really talk. Instead, he just communicates by holding up a chalkboard with handwritten messages. It's pretty hilarious. There's one point where the office is asked what team they're rooting for tonight, and he just holds up a sign with the New York Yankees logo. At least I think it's the Yankees logo. But that chalkboard, as crazy as it sounds, becomes his whole personality. It's funny, and it's weirdly expressive. It all just kind of works. Now, the cool thing is that during She-Hulk issue number 14, which we'll talk about again here in a minute, you kind of get this little bit of a backstory, which explains why it is that Awesome Andy ended up developing this kind of independent personality. And it came when he was taken by the Mad Thinker, who expanded his abilities and then had him face off against Thor. And one of the things you learn is that because of the alterations of the Mad Thinker, Awesome Andy doesn't just copy powers anymore, he copies attributes, which at the time felt more like he'd be able to copy the fighting styles of various characters. But in his conflict with Thor, after touching him, Awesome Andy is able to take the hammer. And there's a kind of transformation that happens there because Thor has this conversation with him where he says, now you're kind of your own person. Only a person who is truly worthy could actually wield this hammer. And the fact that you could lift it means you are capable of becoming your own person. And so he ultimately just kind of goes forward, developing this level of sentience, and I wouldn't say becoming a full-on superhero, but begins going in that direction. As that's why if you read that story in isolation, it doesn't really seem to line up with everything that was going on in She-Hulk at the time, because it's kind of his own origin story to a degree. But over the course of Dan Slott's run, Awesome Andy becomes kind of endearing. Like, he's helpful, he's polite, he's got great timing for visual gags, and slowly he starts to feel like a real character, just not this leftover piece of Silver Age trivia. And in fact, there's one point where Reed Richards shows up and basically confirms that Andy is fully autonomous, that he's no longer under the Mad Thinker's control, all of which was because of his experience in facing off against Thor. Now, the real gut punch for his character actually comes during She-Hulk issue number 14, specifically with volume 2, because Andy had actually been crushing on one of the firm's attorneys, a woman named Mallory Book. Now, the reality here is she's not really somebody you would traditionally crush on. I mean, she's exceedingly cold. She's not exactly known for her warmth. But one day, Andy writes on a chalkboard that he has feeling for her, and Mallory's kind of shocked, but then gently turns him down. No drama, no mockery, just there comes a point when Awesome Andy actually forms a relationship with Mallory. But what you end up learning here is that he had at one point come into contact with Star Fox, and as most of you guys know about Thanos' brother, he has the ability to essentially emit pheromones that basically drives people to experience varying degrees of love for him. Well, Awesome Andy had picked up on this, and Awesome Andy had been unintentionally using his powers on Mallory. And so once he realized that was the case and disabled his ability to mimic powers, Mallory was disgusted and she bailed. She immediately took off. And so you have this guy who we know is a robot, we know he's mute, doesn't talk, he doesn't really seem to experience human emotion, or at least can't express them in the way that we're traditionally used to. But at the same time, you can't help but feel bad for him. Right? You just kind of, your heart aches a little bit because it's like, man, this guy's really experiencing the pain of loss. It's a very small scene, but it hit incredibly hard because this was a character who for decades didn't have any thoughts. And now here he is feeling things and responding like a real person. It's all still wordless, right? It's still chalkboard only, but it said a lot. And so after the whole She-Hulk run, Awesome Andy just kind of drifted into the background again. I mean, he does show up in a courtroom cameo in Fantastic Four 591. He's referenced occasionally as part of the Mad Thinker's legacy. And then in 2020, Marvel launched this event called Iron Man 2020, basically about the rise of artificial intelligence in the Marvel Universe. And this is where Andy pops back up in a meaningful way, because he ends up joining this group called the AI Army, which is led by Arno Stark, who most of you guys know is the brother of Tony Stark. Now, the army includes characters like Jocasta, Machine Smith, and other robot or android characters who have been in and out over the years of Marvel Comics, but are basically fighting for AI rights. Andy doesn't really have a big speaking role. He's still mute at this point, and he's still in the background, but the fact fact that he's even there is pretty significant, right? He's recognized as one of Marvel's oldest artificial life forms. He's not just an out-of-date henchman anymore. Instead, he's part of the bigger conversation about what artificial beings mean within this universe. And that's kind of amazing. Now, most recently, he did pop up again in She-Hulk number 10 from 2023. He's back at Mallory Book's law firm. There's no big entrance, no dramatic return. He's just there, still working, still quiet, still awesome Andy. He doesn't get a speech or a storyline or anything. He's just showing up enough to tell fans, yeah, like, he's still around. And that's basically it. But the reality is that he's this character that had so much potential to be so incredibly powerful. But ultimately, Marvel kind of squandered him and just sort of relegated him to the background. Maybe that'll change, right? Maybe one day we'll see awesome Andy become this villain with like phenomenal cosmic power. But until then, he's just in a She-Hulk comic. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you think about this kind of video. Should we cover like super obscure characters in Marvel and even DC? Let me know what you guys think. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.